Thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very excited to be here and really, really delighted to share some thoughts as you come to the end of your day. Thank you so much again for having me. So I want to share a story with all of you to get us started. And I'd like you all to imagine the filter queen. I wonder if any of you know what a filter queen is. I suspect most of you don't. When I asked all the folks in my office if they knew what it was, they sort of looked at me with wonder and somewhat craziness. Well, if I were to tell you that my own journey with risk-taking started with the filter queen, you probably wouldn't know what I meant. But indeed, when I was probably 17 or 18 years old and dying to have my first job outside my parents' small business, I searched high and low in my own local town, to find an opportunity where someone would employ me, something you all can relate to. And in fact, I found a job as a receptionist at the local filter queen office. So for those of you who don't know what the filter queen is, if you haven't Googled it by now, I'll tell you, it is the preeminent vacuum cleaner of the 1980s. It is a vacuum cleaner that would cost anywhere from $700 to $1,700 and promised housewives that it was the magical machine that would make their houses spick and span. So as I enter my first job as the receptionist at this local filter queen franchise, where a small business owner has the rights to sell the filter queen in our local town in Canada, I enter a very shabby building. My boss is in a room behind me, and while he drives a pretty sweet Jaguar, nothing about this office would indicate that it was on its way to success. And what I quickly realized is while I'm at the front desk, taking all the phone calls in my very first job, all the action is happening off on a room to the right. And you might say, well, what's happening off in the room to the right? And in fact, what's happening is you've got a bunch of people, like random people, old people, young people, and they all have people with babies, and they all have yellow books. And if all of you remember this, yellow books are like big directories of people to call, the phone numbers for everybody in your town, open on tables, and they're all dialing for dollars. And you say, well, why are they dialing for dollars? And of course, they were dialing for dollars to make a living. They were dialing for dollars to literally cold call people and set up demos to demonstrate the filter queen and walk into someone's home and walk out with a sale, and earn their commission and indeed their living. But for me, while this might have seemed like a very quirky group, a somewhat odd group, and maybe a tribe that none of us would want to admit to being a part of, by the end of that summer, I'd learned something pretty important, which is to put yourself out there in any way, shape, or form, small or big, to achieve something you want is to take a risk. And in some ways, there is nothing more noble than doing that. And whether you're selling a filter queen or selling a patented technology or selling your vision to a venture capitalist, or indeed walking into any room that you're a part of and trying to make your case and take a risk to speak up, these are all the ways in which we take risks every day to have impact in our careers. And in fact, that lesson has stayed with me. And now 25 years into a career in technology and as both an entrepreneur and executive, it has sort of stayed with me that there's nothing more powerful than teaching people how to take risk and to understand that risk is not just for the mighty among us, but it's for all of us. So I'm going to ask you all to do something here. We have 45 minutes together. I'm going to ask you all to do something simple, which is to go to this link, choosepossibility.com/risk-quiz. And when you have a moment, I'm going to ask you to take a very simple quiz that I put together to help people understand whether or not risk-taking is something that they do easily, that they do with more trepidation, or that they hesitate to do. Call it a 2 to 3 minute quiz that will help each of you understand your own risk-taking style. And I think when you do that, and we're not going to do it today because I realize we got off to a small start, you're going to find that, you may be in, one of 4 different zones of what I call risk takers. And if you're curious to see what the rest of the population looks like, well, I'm about to share it with you. Here on this slide, you're going to find the results of actually that same risk-taking quiz for the sample survey that we put out this quiz to of general, US population in order to both test the quiz, obviously, and to take a look at the early results and see what that quiz was telling us. And in fact, you'll all go off and take the risk quiz on your own. But what you're likely to find, and what I suspected before I ever wrote the book, and indeed turns out to be true, is that for the vast majority of people, they fall into what I call one simple risk-taking style, which is that they are contemplators. So what is a contemplator, you might ask? A contemplator is somebody who quite easily, can do the pros and cons of any situation, who's thoughtful, who wants to sort of make good decisions and plan. All of us would, identify with being a contemplator. But contemplators also struggle with how to make a decision. Contemplators struggle with, whether or not to do this or that. Contemplators have a, great ease in identifying the entirety of a situation and the entire landscape. But when it comes to making choices, they struggle a little bit, even choices that they know they will regret not making later. If you look to the next style, what we call the calculator and the contemplator are pretty similar. The difference between the calculator and the contemplator comes down to not only the ability to assess choices, but get comfortable making a decision and acting within a definitive time frame. Inside the quiz, you'll also find two other archetypes, what we call the change seeker and what we call the critic. And if you're thinking about who these people might be, or what these styles might be, because any of us could show up with any one of these styles on a given day, but by and large, the critic is someone who more naturally sees the danger in a situation, and the change seeker is quite the opposite, somebody who moves forth in the world, making decisions so quickly, moving so fast from thing to thing, that sometimes, we wonder if they're overcommitting to too many things, or in fact, bouncing from place to place. But their comfort with moving is quite large. The last thing we found in taking the survey, besides the fact that the majority of people are contemplators, is that there are in fact differences between women and men. Women are more likely to be critics and contemplators, while men were more likely, slightly by the way, not by large amounts, to be both change seekers and calculators. One other big finding that I'd love to share is that you might think that being in the highest income bracket, being richer or wealthier, and which people equate with more success, might make you more likely, to take risks. And in fact, there are differences in the ability of those people or the natural styles of those people to be change seekers. But what's also interesting is that bracket of people were the most critical. And ironically, as they got more success, this would indicate that they didn't find it easier to make decisions, but potentially harder, because they were looking more critically at the downside of any situation, despite the fact that they've had plenty of success. So let's move on. I want to help you understand that in this context of risk-taking and risk-taking styles, we all know we should take more risk. All of you have been taught and told about the growth mindset. Many of you are contemplating or are already entrepreneurs. And so you might wonder why it's so hard for people to take risk at all. And if you just step back and look at the definition of risk, well, you probably have some idea as to the answer. The definition in the Merriam-Webster dictionary for risk-taking is, or for risk, not risk-taking, is the possibility of loss or injury. The second definition is someone or something that creates or suggests a hazard. If you look at that definition, it's no surprise that the vast majority of people, when you mention the word risk, think far more about the harm than the possibilities it creates. Next slide, please. It's with this in mind, obviously, that I wrote the book, coming out this August in the US, and in Europe it will be releasing, I believe, on September 2nd, that really talks about putting possibility back in the reframing of risk. And in a world where we've just all had, I would say, a year and a half of having to take risks that we never thought we would take in order to simply survive in our careers, let alone thrive, we have an opportunity to reframe what risk looks like for ourselves going forward, take the lessons we've learned in the pandemic, and think about how we apply new frameworks to risk-taking in a very concrete and tangible way that can help every single person in this room or on this Zoom succeed in their own careers. And that's obviously, the core thesis of not just the book, but what I believe to be true. So I want to step back once more, and before we get to some of the tactical and practical things you can do to think about how to embrace risk-taking in your own life, I want to talk about what starts us on this journey and the fallacy that we often succumb to that we need to replace with something better. It's what I call the myth of the single choice. So many of you can look at this sort of yellow blob on the page and think, yes, I can relate to a choice that I thought was somewhat big. Well, let's add to that choice the dimension of time and whether or not that choice is sort of sitting on this framework that we would call failure or success, right? We basically come into any decision with this binary mindset that something is either a failure or success. And in fact, if you sort of think about that even further, we think that we're either headed straight up or down to epic failure with any single choice we make. This is what I call the myth of the single choice. And the vast majority of people that, we talk to, and in fact ourselves, think about choice in this binary way. And we also think about choice as singular, this mighty choice that leads to success or failure. And the pressure to make that move, in fact, is what creates these, I would say, trepidation of risk taking that I've talked about earlier. So let's move one further and think about, this mindset of the single choice and what it means for us. Well, to start with, it means that every time we think about making a choice, we think about it often with one mindset, which is to achieve an ambition. But in fact, there are many, many reasons we can make choices and take risks that are not nearly so daunting as this myth of a single choice. And if I were to posit to you reasons to take risks today, I would say there's not one, this idea of climbing some mighty mountain, but there's probably four. So let's just identify what those four are. First of all, let's go back to that, that simple filter queen example I gave you. Every day, everywhere, there is opportunity to take risks to discover new opportunities. I mean, risk taking for the discovery of opportunities is probably something, none of us would really call a risk, but it abounds. If you're thinking about starting a new business, the opportunity to go do informational research starts today. If you're thinking about making a career switch, the idea to sort of think about what 5 jobs you might be interested in starts today. That's all small moves that you can make simply for the opportunity to discover. Secondly, of course, and this might be familiar to people, but again, it's not something we often associate with risk-taking, is really risk-taking to learn. Every time someone offers you an opportunity that at first blush doesn't seem like a obvious, large and gigantic step towards your ambition, ask yourself if what you really have is risk-taking ability to learn and an opportunity to make a choice that can advance your thinking. Third, of course, and the most common and popular way we think about risk-taking to the upside is to achieve a mighty ambition. Those of you who are entrepreneurs know exactly what I'm talking about. And in fact, we all dream about taking a risk to achieve something nonlinear and rather grand. And then lastly, and we'd have to stop and think about this one, but in fact, we've all just lived it. We take risk-taking to avoid harm, right? And you say risk-taking to avoid harm, that really doesn't make any sense. But in the context of the pandemic, in the context of all of us having to make choices far more swiftly and agilely and resiliently than we ever thought we could, we would all agree that we've experienced, having to take a risk or make a choice to avoid the potential for danger or further loss. And in the case of COVID, we all face threats to our very livelihood, our careers, and in many cases, our businesses. As the CEO of StubHub at the time that the COVID pandemic struck, I can tell you completely that I saw risk-taking in action, in a agile and rapid way, and in some ways far more agile and rapidly than I saw in the company in steady state when we were faced with the crisis and the pandemic and a total business shutdown and need to react. So the first thing you need to do if you think about sort of how to sort of cross the risk-taking chasm, move from thinking about it as binary to something that offers you multiple opportunities, is I would encourage you to expand that risk-taking lens you have and look at the 4 reasons to take risk and find opportunities every day to do so. But if that's not enough for you, if you say like, hey, why move today versus tomorrow? Well, let's just look at the other repercussions of not choosing today, small or big. Just not choosing to decide to punt a decision to tomorrow or the next day, or to punt an opportunity. Well, according to the World Economic Forum, if you think about what happens in our careers when we fail to make choices to advance, in fact, something pretty interesting happens. The value of our skills actually decline. And in a world of change that is only accelerating, reskilling is becoming more needed than ever. In fact, the World Economic Forum estimates that every 5 years, the value of a skill you have depreciates in value, declines by 50%. So if you don't believe in taking risk proactively and finding opportunities, the risk of not moving is depreciation of a skill set in a moving career and entrepreneurial landscape. More interestingly, if you think about how this applies in other paradigms we consider, not just skills, but let's say companies, you can look at the book, and I highly recommend this book for any of you, who are running organizations. McKinsey's book, Beyond the Hockey Stick, Growth Beyond the Hockey Stick, really analyzed the success and failures of companies over a 30-year time frame. Think of this book as like The New Good to Great by Jim Collins, which did a similar study many years ago. But in the McKinsey study and looking at companies over 30 years, what they really found is that over the longer term, for companies to stay static, they are far more likely to go, i.e., be prone to failure, than companies that make multiple moves. And in fact, the McKinsey study found that companies that make multiple moves, not all of them right, are far more likely to ascend what they call the power curve, the curve that leads to, to nonlinear success. So in fact, staying still has far more risk to both our skills, our companies, and the careers that we hope to have than one might imagine. So if you want to act, what does it really take? If you debunk the myth of the single choice, you look at opportunities to take risk every day, you tell yourself that in fact, not embracing a growth mindset will lead to the declines I just talked about. Why do people still not act? Well, I think we are all kind of, in some ways, dominated by one other thing, which is this universal risk-taking equation. And if you think about what I mean by the universal risk-taking equation, well, here is its elements. In that risk-taking equation, you put two terms, FOMO, everybody knows this, fear of missing out. We all have FOMO, and when we dream about the things we'll accomplish, what we do is we ramp our FOMO. We really think about, what it is that we will achieve and visualize the positive elements and the fear we have of missing out of those positive benefits. But the other part of that risk-taking equation is the second fear, what I call FOF, or more commonly known as fear of failure. And this, of course, is what everybody refers to when they talk about not acting, the fear of simply failing. And that failure has multiple shadows to it, which we'll talk about in a moment. So if you look at FOMO and you look at fear of failure, the first thing you realize is that any risk-taking equation actually encounters two fears, not one. We often think of risk-taking as being about one fear. But let's look at those equations in action. If our fear of failure is greater than our FOMO, we will fail to act. And if our FOMO is greater than our fear of failure, we will in fact take action. So think about this risk-taking equation, and what's probably racing through your head next is, well, gee, if I want to act, I need to ramp my FOMO, right? I should just keep visualizing the positives of any situation in order to get myself to take a risk. And well, in fact, visualization has a lot of positive benefits, and we all know that it's the way we sustain ourselves over the long term. Visualizing alone doesn't really get you to conquer your fear of failure. And in fact, when you think about that fear of failure, and its repercussions, I would posit that there's far more repercussions to not dealing with our failures and not dealing with the fears we have of failure than there is in dealing with the upside of any situation, which is far more easier for any of us to imagine. So let's go look at those risks that we fear and those fears that we have of failure. I would bucket them in three different categories. Most of us fail to act because our fear of failure stems from either ego risk, the fear of what we'll think of ourselves if we fail, or what others will think of us, in fact. Financial risk, and all of you know this well, like the fear that simply, you will lose money, you will lose income, you will face a threat to your ability to sustain yourself financially. And of course, the third element of any career choice is really personal risk. And often we fail to name this risk because we're ashamed of talking about it with others, because we think it looks weak to talk about the risk of, whether our family life is happy, and whether or not, we think about personal risk as like sort of being joyful in our jobs, but we really don't like to admit the other elements of our lives that we're trading off. COVID hopefully has made us all more willing to talk about the personal risks that any of our career choices entails. And in fact, it may be the one time where we are ready to feel more vulnerable with others in showing them the personal sides of who we are. But these are the three risks that we all look at and that we all fear when we think about this fear of failure. So if you're thinking about how to get that risk-taking kind of equation working in your favor, well, there's one thing you need to do, which is, think not just about the things that could go wrong, but embrace one other thing. And the one other thing I'd like you to embrace and to think about is the fact that, the risks we face and fear are one of our own. There is one other set of risks that I would call our subways and coconut risks. And then the thing I would ask you to do is, when you plan or think about taking an action and think about fear of failure, well, in that ego, financial, and personal risk we talked about, think about the subways and coconuts, that may happen. And the subways are the risks you can predict. you can in fact predict the level of financial volatility that you might encounter in making a career choice. That is what we call a known risk. It's the same as, the reason it's called a subway risk is it's the same risk that you might encounter in sort of knowing that you can head to the train station and, the subway might be 5 minutes early or 5 minutes late. And that's a risk you can anticipate and should anticipate in your thinking. And, and you want to factor that volatility, into sort of the risk equations that you're thinking about. But the other types of risks are what we call coconut risks. And if you want to know what a coconut-sized risk looks like, we'll just think about COVID. Coconut risks are called risks that are sort of unanticipated. They're named this way because it's literally the risk that a coconut drops out of a tree, falls on your head, breaks your skull open, and you die. And we all think about these risks as, like impossible to predict, right? They're once in a lifetime events. But in fact, coconut events also occur a little more frequently than we all realize. And as I said, we just went through one. So if you're thinking about the ultimate coconut, COVID taught us what that looks like. So when you think about your own risk-taking equation, you want to take into account your ego risk, your financial risk, your personal risk, and as best you can, you want to anticipate the subways, and you want to understand that the coconuts are almost never knowable, and those are the risks to which we need to respond once we've made a choice. So how do you get into action? How do you sort of conquer that, looking at all of those factors? Well, I would say that most of us spend, as we talked about, all of our time dreaming and planning about the upside. They look at that myth of the single choice and they think, well, gee, if I just plan enough, if I plan in enough detail, I can sort of plan away all these risks and I can imagine every successive choice I'll make by creating a perfect, what I call upside plan. In fact, if you think about that risk-taking equation, I would posit that it's far more in your interest to do what's harder, which is plan to the downside. And when I think about planning to take a risk, when I think about trying to conquer the risk-taking equation myself, I actually spend far more time on what I call downside planning. So what does that really mean? Well, if you were to quote Jeff Bezos, in the case of small risks and small choices, it means looking at whether or not those decisions you're looking at making are one-way doors or two-way doors. And in his shareholder letter, when he first took Amazon public, Jeff Bezos actually identified that Amazon is very comfortable making decisions because most decisions that the company will make are in fact two-way doors. They're decisions you can make and go through, and you can come back through that door if it doesn't work out. And in fact, when we want to conquer our fear of failure, the right thing to do is to look at the choices after the choice. If we were to make a choice that failed, what are our paths back to the place we are or our paths forward from there? And Jeff Bezos would posit that a lot of the decisions that we're faced with making are two-way doors. And he would say that very few of them are what you call one-way doors, that when you go through, there's no way back. But let's imagine a bigger choice where there is no way back, where there are not many, many options to recover. Then the best thing you can do, of course, is spend your time planning how exactly it is you will recover, planning to the downside with far more detail than you might plan to the upside. And so when you think about conquering that risk-taking equation, do what comes easy, which is visualize FOMO, but embrace what's harder, which is thinking about the two-way doors of any decision, realizing they're far more abundant than you think. And then thinking about the one-way doors, and when you really are faced with a larger decision, planning far more for the downside in your contingencies than for the upside. Not to be able to not act, but in fact to be able to get into action. So I want to move on to one other topic, and we'll end here before I take your questions, which is really thinking about everything I've sort of outlined, the myth of the single choice, the risk-taking equation we all face, the one-way doors and two-way doors and how to plan. And to realize, really that at the end of this, the path to becoming a great risk taker is one that is really about building a risk-taking muscle. And when we talk about sort of the myth of the single choice, part of the reason we have this binary view is because we look at risk takers in the world, whether it's Elon Musk or whether it's Chamath or whether it's Jeff Bezos, and we say to ourselves, wow, these are mighty risk takers. They take such large risks. But in fact, what's true of anybody who takes a large risk successfully is often they have taken hundreds, if not thousands, of risks before and become fairly adept at risk taking. So if you want to think about risk taking, the best way to think about it is as a muscle that every day you delay building, and every day you embrace in order to be able to make not just small decisions, but larger decisions as they come your way. So how should you do it? Well, I'm going to leave you with 3 key tips that I think can help any and all of you think about risk-taking as a muscle that you build yourselves and actively. Number one, come back to those first principles I talked to, early and often. Look for reasons to take risks today, and don't look for reasons that sort of give you an opportunity to not act by thinking about some grand ambition, but more importantly, the little risks you can take in all four of the categories I mentioned, and get into a practice of taking them early and often. And a risk can be as minuscule as speaking up in a meeting, or as I said, it could be as medium-sized as sort of doing research on a company you're thinking of starting, or as gigantic as quitting your job and putting your house in, up for sale if you want to create the first dollars to finance it, which is a mighty risk. But you've got to start now, and you've got to look for reasons every day. The second thing you want to do is really think about, and you can go to the next slide. The second thing you want to do is really think about pipelining in parallel. When we think about risk taking, we often think of it as sequential. I must take this risk today, and then when I get the answer, I'll take that risk tomorrow. And in fact, once we get into what I call execution mode and we've made a rather large career choice, yes, you often execute sequentially. But before you ever make big choices, you take many, many risks in parallel. Some people call this risk diversification. Other people I call it pipelining. But it's really the idea that you want to be in discovery mode and risk-taking mode and put multiple sort of opportunities into the water and discover them in parallel versus in sequence. This is what allows us, by the way, to take small risks and big risks at the same time. Before we ever commit to a choice, we can commit to pipelining and really putting multiple things in motion before we ever make our large choice. And really at that point, having the most ambitious of opportunities sit right side by side with what you'd call our safe choices. The best example of this for people in the US or even internationally is looking at how students apply to universities. It is pipelining in parallel in the biggest format. They look for safety schools and they look for their dream schools, but never would they think of really going after only one school. And then the last thing I want to tell you, and this probably makes the most sense for the calculators in the room, is value proximity over planning. And this comes back to sort of that notion I sort of talked about earlier. When we think about planning, many people plan to make a choice by endlessly planning. They plan at all the steps that will go right without ever taking the first. But if you really want to get into motion, what you want to do is get yourself proximate to the opportunities you dream of before you ever make the bigger choice. So if you want to be an entrepreneur but don't know how, that means, joining a startup, as opposed to leaping straight from your big job into being an entrepreneur and not even understanding what that means. If you're thinking about starting a company in a certain sector, it means literally doing the work to get close to people who've already succeeded in that sector and spending, 10 cycles of informational coffees, to really figure out how they did it. It means apprenticing in the things that you don't understand yourself. And so while you're so busy thinking about planning, you're often planning from afar and planning in abstract, while getting proximate to opportunity might be the best and smartest way to take a risk. With that, I want to finish up and just talk about, how I think about risk-taking and how I posit that we should all think about risk-taking, which is as the opposite of rash, as the opposite of a mighty leap that you have to sort of gear yourself up to make, and thus you never do, but really as something far more calculated, and learning how to be calculated on small risks and move quickly, and calculated on bigger risks and move thoughtfully but move. And as General Patton would say, take calculated risks that is quite different, in fact, from being rash. So what does this mean next for all of you? Well, really, I think it means, simply that you have an opportunity wherever you go in your risk-taking style, to take that calculator in you, that contemplator in you, that change seeker in you, or that critic in you, and move yourselves towards what I call being a chooser. And a chooser is not someone who chooses once. A chooser is someone who, by definition, chooses again and again and again. And by choosing again and again and again, and moving yourself into sort of a risk-taking mindset that is one that is far more geared towards practice and calculation than sort of mighty one-off choices, you have a far greater chance of unlocking, compounding benefits from risk-taking and compounding career benefit, as I've been lucky enough to do, by taking multiple hundreds, if not thousands of risks inside of your career.